So in this episode, we're going to talk about breaking bread. And before you tune out or hit pause or go to another podcast, you're like, well, I don't want to, that doesn't sound very interesting to talk about. There's a lot of things to unpack about the role of breaking bread, opening up the dinner table to multiplying disciples. So let's unpack that coming up. All right, guys, so today in this episode, we're going to sit around the table, which we are. You can't probably hear that in the podcast, but we're going to sit around the table and talk about opening up the table and the role of breaking bread together in the Spirit strategy. So, Dave, you kind of teed this up in our conversation offline before we hit record. Where do you think we should start?
I think we should start with breaking bread is far more in the scriptures than just what we would say communion or the Lord's Supper.
Okay.
So we use the church circle, call it waffle, here in Oklahoma City that you helped to kind of really pioneer and get developed from Acts 2. And it says they devoted themselves, right, to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread,
right,
to the fellowship, to the breaking bread, and to the prayers. And so oftentimes when we do that, we want to use the breaking of bread as a way to say we ought to remember the Lord's death until he comes, right? And so we go rightfully so to the breaking of bread. But if we look at 1 Corinthians, we also see that practice of the Lord's Supper was in the middle of a meal. I don't know about you. I grew up, we talk about this all the time, I grew up Baptist, and I don't really think that I would get too stuffed on the little crispy wafers that they gave us. So in 1 Corinthians, we're seeing that people are getting way too much to eat, other people aren't getting enough to eat, so it's clearly within the framework. We see that in Acts 2, the very beginning of church, that they were doing this from house to house. So just from our experience, breaking bread, having, whether it be coffee or a full meal or whatever, just provides a lot of opportunities for things that are well beyond the very important practice of remembering the Lord's death until he comes.
Yeah. That's really good. I think one of the pieces that we were talking about is just how much the breaking of bread drives us towards living out the things that we value. And I know Dave and I both, and I bet a lot of you listening have either been a part of a church, you've been on staff of the church, or something where on a website you've got this whole list of all the things we believe, all the things we value, but then you look at the practice and the life of that church and you're like, is this the wrong website for that church, right? And so part of what happens around the dinner table when you break bread is it takes those values and you begin to live them out, and they're put into practice, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've learned from you here in Oklahoma City is just the idea of the concept we refer to as a centered set.
Yeah.
The idea of finding a way, and you've been teaching me much, I've learned much about, instead of trying to create a boundary, that we would tell people they're in or out. So let's say in the case of a website, this is our value. Agree or disagree makes you in or out.
Right.
Transitioning our thoughts to saying this is the values, this is the point of the center of the community, and the point is that you accept that you want to journey towards those values. And it creates a culture. The culture actually starts to revolve around moving closer to those values instead of being cast out or in or out based upon do you agree with or disagree with those values.
Yeah.
Right, so what are some ways, Mark, that you think that value conversation, that centered set idea is vital to, in this case, leadership development, right, where we're talking about head, hearts, and hands. What's so important about that in terms of developing leaders?
So we can get stuck in a development of leaders and collaboration as leaders, that place of agreement. Do we agree? Do we disagree? Are we on the same page with everything? And part of what that does, and we've been talking about that a lot lately here in OKC, is it kind of creates these silos where you think a certain way, and then you can only relate to people who think the certain way and are building the same silo, basically.
Right.
But it begins to tear down those silos because across the table, you begin to relate. First of all, you're telling jokes, you're hanging out, you're just having fun, and it kind of leads into you relating as people, and you beginning to talk about common challenges and commonalities because you want to relate and you want to connect, and then that leads you to seeing the values of what other people might have that you don't have.
So that really kind of brings out what we want to point out as far as why breaking bread is so important, because there's something about gathering around a table. Like we said, it could be over a cup of coffee, it could be over a meal, but there's something about that just enables us to create space for the Spirit to show us the strategy that he's after. One of the things about the centered set is we're saying the idea is the center of everything is Jesus. Yeah. And we're all moving. And the Spirit's work in our lives and the life of us as individuals and the life of us as a community is going to be moving us towards Jesus's character, Jesus's strategy, Jesus, the heart of the Father that we see Jesus living out. And so we need to create space in order for us as a community, in this case, let's say leaders, we have to create space in order for us to think together, to hear together, and to respond together on what the Spirit is teaching us and showing us. And to be honest with you, it's not bullet points on a whiteboard or on a website. Oftentimes that is created together as we discuss and move together towards what he's saying, which takes time.
It does take time. And then one of the things you were highlighting is the way that creates a buy-in and accounting of the cost together. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I think when we set values for what we want to see, especially when it comes to a no place left idea, that's going to cost a lot. We have to make a decision, as you would use the term high value activities. In order for you to choose to do high value activities, you have to say no to other things. That cost sometimes is saying no to other things may injure, let's say, relationships, because you're having to devalue what other people might value. Or it might be that the activities we choose to buy into as a community to move towards no place left are going to get pushback from the culture, and it's going to end up costing us something. And if I'm doing that by myself, that carrying that weight alone is very difficult. But if I know that you're in it with me, and we continue to spend time breaking bread in that environment, we've talked about, listened to, and responded to the Spirit together, then I know that you carry the same value as me, and now we're carrying that weight together. Whatever that cost may be, because of no place left, it allows us to do that together, and it develops a brotherhood that I think it's impossible to do this without a true kind of brotherhood relationship.
Yeah, so the table combined with that idea of a centered set of living out the values, it's redefining even what a leader is versus somebody who's just charismatic and we're all on the same page and you've got the most knowledge, to those that are living this out, and then they've got others that are living this out that are following them, and then how do we begin to relate together and live this out together?
And to just put it into context, we're talking about this idea today. The way that we were discussing this idea was I've been spending a lot of time in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st Chronicles, and this idea that the only reason that I think 1st and 2nd Kings ultimately was written, well, for the history of Israel, but what we really see through those two is this is what happens whenever leadership wars take place. And the idea was God was really their king, and Israel had denied their God as their king and judges, and they came to the place where they're like, we want a king, because they were having lots of issues as a community, staying faithful, staying on point, and just walking with Jesus, or in this case, the Father's law, walking according to the Father's law without someone who was there telling them exactly when to do it and how to do it. So they wanted a king. Ultimately, we see that points to Jesus, and he's our one true king. But whenever we set up like David, or we set up Solomon, we read those stories and we think, man, I want to be David. But the truth is that I kind of want to be his mighty men. I want to be the one who's saying, the king is setting the agenda, and my response is to say, give me my orders, let me respond. There's one story in particular that I think really demonstrates this idea a lot. Not that we want to go on raiding parties with each other like David and his men were doing, but there's one particular story where David is off and he's fighting a particular battle. He's been anointed as king, but nobody really knows it yet, and people are gathering around him, and there is a raiding party from another enemy that comes and raids their camp, burns everything, takes off with their wives and their children, and they get back and they see that all this has happened. And there's this particular moment when David, the Bible says, is in a very tough spot, right? Because all of his men's families are now gone. And they were off doing what David wanted to do, and he's trying to figure out what to happen. So he prays to the Lord and says, Lord, what should I do? Should we attack? And he says, yes, go and attack. And the Bible says that when they went and attacked, they had a great victory, and they recovered all of their possessions, all of their women, and all their children. Nothing was missing. and everybody then began to rejoice, and David as their leader became very important. Why do I tell that story? David didn't decide what to do. God decided what to do, and David asked him and responded accordingly to that.
Yeah.
And those men that were with David experienced that victory together. And they experienced that victory knowing that God used David as the influencer of the leader in that particular moment.
Yeah.
And so later, when significant pushback comes on David, where were those men?
Yeah.
Right by his side.
Yeah.
The point I'm getting at is that when all of that took place, the reason that David's men could stay strong and true and committed with him as their king wasn't because David was telling them all, you should follow me. It's because they had experienced things together that had knit them as a kind of the Team of Teams book, shared consciousness.
Yeah.
They understood what God was doing. They had gone through trials together. They had each other's back. There was a brotherhood that was formed, and they counted the cost together, and it created more and more and more buy-in.
That's right.
On what they were doing together. And so it quit being like, I'm here, David's here. It was we.
Yeah.
It left we're a whole bunch of disjointed riffraff to we. Together are doing this, and that can't be manufactured.
No.
And it requires time together. And so that breaking of bread, though we might not be going on raiding parties and fighting wars together, we actually are in the kingdom in the sense as we serve together, but that time around the table,
that's right,
of just being with one another and talking about what God is doing creates that environment for us.
It does. The other thing we were talking about is how I think that can take our eyes off of facing each other in battle to facing the common enemy in battle and working together. And so when we're shoulder to shoulder, there's that place of we're tackling this thing together, but it also diffuses the voice of the enemy as we're getting around the table. I think we talk about David's mighty men. I could imagine each one of them having this thought, and maybe even people around them saying, like, you could go lead, you could go do this, you could go build your own kingdom. Why are you not in this spot? And so that can get in your head, and I think we all, if we're honest, wrestle with that temptation to build our own kingdom and to use our influence to build our thing, right? And so what I have experienced with you, with what's happening in Oklahoma City and other places, is when we get around the table, the voice of the enemy is brought in the light, and he doesn't have that same space in my head and others to speak those lies, and it brings us back to facing the right direction rather than facing each other.
We've talked a lot about COVID on this just because we just came out of the COVID season, and I'm thankful for the ways that technology has actually advanced the gospel, the way that people have gotten more used to maybe online opportunities than they were before. But I will go back and say, and I would even tack on, I think, biblically about this. I don't think it's thus saith the Lord, but I do think that there is an element that cannot be replaced of being face-to-face, in person.
That's right.
And breaking bread provides that opportunity for the things like you just said. And so it's very hard to be angry with a brother and create silos that begin to have leadership wars against one another. Right. Instead of partnerships with each other when you're with each other.
Right.
There's a reason I think that the Bible calls the church a family.
Yeah.
It's just time together creates that shared consciousness about how we're moving together. So what do you think some benefits that come out of just this principle of breaking bread together?
Well, so we've talked a little bit about the silo breaking, where silos begin to come down as we see the need for each other and realize, really, it's like we realize the end of ourselves. We can't get it done by ourselves, and we need each other. So those begin to come down. But I'd love to ask you, what do you see about how the table makes space for the relationships that God wants to bring together? How does he make that happen?
Well, I think they're unexpected often, Mark, because we can approach the mission or the strategy as we have to set the agenda. We have to come up with what's going to happen, who should relate to one another. In Oklahoma City in particular, we don't have an official organization. It's all very relational. You and I have learned much from the Houston network. And one of the things we learned from the Houston network, which has been super helpful from a gentleman by the name of Guy Caskey and a lot of the great leaders that God has used to raise up around him, is that it's relational before it's organizational. I know that the team in Tampa uses that often.
They do.
Lee's poured into you a ton and done that. And then the other piece that he brought in that I thought was super helpful is don't organize an it until what?
You've got an it to organize.
Right. So
that's so sticky. I love that phrase.
Sticky.
Don't organize it till you got an it to organize.
And it comes back to what we're saying. If things are relational before they're organizational, breaking bread together creates that relational environment. And if we think there's an it to organize before there's something to organize, we're trying to force relationships. You and I were both youth pastors in some of our former lives. And we would experience trying to make relationships happen for parents whose kid didn't really feel a part. And I don't know about you, but sometimes they worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes they were absolute train wrecks, right? It's kind of like an accountability relationship. If you try to force an accountability relationship, or you try to force a mentoring relationship, any type of force relationship, the people involved, if they don't want to make it work, it's just not going to work. And so sometimes when we sit back and we think our job is to plan God's work, we're going to mess that up. But if we prepare and we create space, then these unexpected moments can happen where relationships happen, where somebody goes, oh, I went to high school with, oh, you went to high school with them, I didn't know. And then the next thing you know, they realize they have a history and a past that has crossed. They didn't know it. And then they find that they have the Father's heart about the same things. And those two things merge together, and the Spirit births out of that a strategy that Jesus has wanted to have happen. And these strategic relationships just organically occur. And all we got to do is respond to it.
Right.
And when we have a moment for those things to happen, there's not a hurry. No one's waiting for a leader to tell them, you need to partner with this person to do X. And they just naturally happen. Those are very strong bound relationships that are very value-based already from the start. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. We've watched it happen a lot.
Yes, we have. Yeah, and one more benefit that we were talking about before we hit record, Dave defined it as a kairos moment. The way I think about that is Luke 4, Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he says, it's the right time for this mission to begin. So it's a God moment that God intersects, and it's the right time. So much of that happens when we make the space for it, and that happens when we break bread, when we're around the table together. And so, I don't know, we were talking, again, before we hit record, just how many of those relationships we can't control. We can't make it happen in our
even
time,
when we want
in our
to.
way. And so that idea of the kairos moment is, it's got to be God-initiated. But I think sometimes, I don't know about you, but I can get in this place where thinking of a kairos moment as it starts relational, and then now it's going to be this. But no, it always comes back to the table. So the kairos moment and that initiated thing, to continue forward, it requires us to keep coming back to the table and make space for what the Lord wants to do, rather than it starting here and then becoming that exclusively. It's always going to remain relational at the core as everything else builds on it. And
as we found out, it better, because whenever the tough times come, or when the leadership costs rise, or when there is unfortunately an attack from the enemy that requires some type of a response, relationships start to get strained. And what we found in Oklahoma City is that as we go to battle in the kingdom together, that those strained relationships actually end up on the outside getting even tighter. But it is the glue that keeps everything together anyway. So someone saying, well, what's your structure? I think as we talk about Oklahoma City, sometimes when people ask, what's your structure? It's really hard to describe, because the structure really is relationship. It really is relationship. And at times we add to that structure for the purposes of getting something done or moving forward. But at the end of the day, if underlying all of those things, there's not that value-based relational structure, titles, org charts, all of the above, they're not going to get anything done anyway.
And they can sustain it for a minute, for a season, they can get you, but then if you don't come back to the table, the momentum of that's going to die, and it's going to fossilize and become institutional. So
right.
It's got to come back to the table.
And whenever I've seen organizational structures that are working really well, it's not because of the organizational structure, it's because of the relationships that are fueling what's described by the organizational structure. So
that's it right there.
Well, I've learned a ton from you in terms of creating culture based upon values. And the way in which you work with a church or a leadership team or a group of people to help others decide whether or not they're a fit to be in or out can happen around that breaking of bread. Why is that so important to create an environment so that people will know whether they want to be in or out, so that we don't as leaders have to determine who gets to be in or out?
I'll try to answer this and then you tell me what you think. But I think with the name of our podcast, Head, Heart, Hands, this is where head, heart, and hands intersect, is when we talk about a centered set of values that we don't have to fully agree, but what are those things that are the minimum that are going to be able to connect us in terms of our theology and thinking? Heart, what is it going to take to count the cost, to be all in, to begin to live this out? And hands, how are we going to do this together? But it's the table that begins to give us the opportunity into those kinds of relationships, into a next step to join in a lifestyle together. And it's not saying I don't want you on the team or I do want you on the team. It's really giving people the opportunity to enter into life together, and they're going to choose to do that or they're going to not. But that's really making the space for the choice to be with them.
Yeah. I don't really have anything to add. I mean, it's I'll be honest, Mark, is in terms of our relationship, it is probably one of the most important things that I've learned from you. As I relate now outside of an organization, and everything we do is based upon relational influence.
Yeah.
Either people give it to me or they don't. They give it to you or they don't. There are no titles, there are no organizations, there are no strings or levers to pull to make something happen based upon an outside structure. We don't have that. And so it's really caused me to have to learn a lot. And in terms of the No Place Left network and coalition that you and I are part of, it's a very decentralized network. There's no top-down structure. People can choose to join and be a part of it because of what we see in the scripture. And do we want to do it or not? And I don't know about you, but once I get into that, I want a community, a brotherhood of people who are like-minded, who are chasing after the same thing, and that we know that we're doing it together, because it just empowers me, it encourages me, and it causes me to go, when I can't give, but let's say 25%, and you can jump up and you can give 175% in that moment, together we're still getting there, and I don't have to feel guilty because I somehow failed. We, not just I.
And so I'm going to throw something out here that Dave doesn't know I'm going to do. But one of the things we like to do when we're doing this podcast is just be really gut level honest and let you behind the curtain. I don't know if that's always the best marketing move or not. But when we were talking about starting this podcast, we were going to call it H3X, Head, Heart, Hands, Multipliers. And Dave came in and he said, yeah, but what about the role of the multiplying church? It's not just the person that God will use, it's the community together that God will use. Would you talk about that a little bit as we end? Head, heart, hands, and why that needs to be the multiplying church and not just the multiplying leader?
Well, because of my arrogance for years and years and years. If you want me to be gut level honest, taking the things that I've learned from you, right? Which, by the way, happened as we broke bread together at Panera Bread.
That's
right. It happened to be where it was when we were sitting at the table and you were first introducing me to the concepts of what I didn't even know was centered set at the time. And talking about the ways in which people bring to the table what should be contributions to the conversation instead of fights about our differences. And my arrogance of thinking, this is the right way of doing it, and then having you challenge me and by not only your words but your life in ways that I wasn't necessarily used to, right? From different denominational backgrounds, different kind of church culture backgrounds, and then watching as we grew together and learn from one another.
Right.
It just completely changed my perspective in the sense of if I'm constantly as an individual looking at it and going, no place left is what I'm going to do, that is full on arrogance. I can't do that. And if Jesus has been after this, I'm going to get a little preachy, I'm sorry. If Jesus has been after this for 2,000 years, And the Father, from the time that Adam and Eve first sinned, has been putting into play for millennia a plan and his will to redeem and restore all things to himself. It's really arrogant of me to think that somehow in my little small blip of maybe 75 years of God's gracious, that I'm going to make such an impact on everything that's happening that it's going to alter the course of history. Jesus altered the course of history.
Right.
My job is to respond to him. And if my job is to respond to him, then we'll go back to what we said. We're creating that space to respond to the Spirit. Jesus is in command. He's the general.
That's good.
And who is he commanding? His church. Who is he guiding? His church. And if the Spirit is leading you, and he's leading me, and he's leading other leaders, then it behooves me to say that I might not know everything. And in my limited experience and perspective, I might need to see what I'm doing not as the definitive answer, but as a contribution that we together can move to see God do what he wants to do. And the church as a whole worldwide, right? I don't know if you guys have heard about or read, but Steve Smith's book, whenever he was writing, the title is skipping out on me.
Spirit Walk?
Not the Spirit Walk, the fictional one they wrote, the No Place Left one.
Yeah, I don't have it.
That's a terrible. I'll bring it up and then I totally forget the title of it. We'll put it in there. But one of the things at the very end of the book was the fact that when Jesus came back, they were like, but we hadn't completed the Great Commission yet. And he's like, yeah, but I've got the church from all around the world has been as busy as you are about that.
Yeah.
It's got to be a we, Mark.
Yeah.
It's got to be a we, because I'm not the king.
Yeah.
Right? You're not the king. We follow the king together. And it's amazing to me. It really is just amazing to me how the simple act, the command, by the way, not the suggestion, the command and the practice that we see in Acts 2 to break bread together.
Yeah.
Eating meals, sharing meals and hospitality together is one of the primary ways that God uses to facilitate everything that we're talking about here. And we're just scratching the surface of how important it is for believers to spend time together. And that's not just because I'm Baptist, right? But really to focus breaking bread around Jesus, his mission, and moving forward together as a church.
Well, I think that's a mic drop. I think we'll leave it there.
A mic drop.
But we hope this has been helpful for you. And if it is, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, share this with friends, and we'll see you guys next time.
See you later.